In the quiet suburbs, everything appears peaceful and harmonious. Corey and Mila have lived here for several years, and at first glance, they seem like the perfect couple. Corey works at an architecture firm, and Mila supposedly runs a small home-based business designing and selling custom clothing. They often spend time together, walking in parks, meeting with friends, and living a life that many would envy. But despite their outward appearance of happiness, Corey has started to notice strange things. Mila, who had always been open and sociable, began to withdraw. She often goes out in the evenings, explaining that she's meeting with clients. She always looks flawless, dressed in expensive outfits, and Corey has even asked her a few times how she manages to run such a successful business without really showing any work. Mila would just smile and assure him everything was under control. But one evening, when she mentioned needing to meet with some partners, Corey noticed that she looked unusually nervous. That was the first red flag, which made him question what was really going on behind the scenes of their seemingly perfect life. At that moment, Corey couldn't imagine that his life was about to be turned upside down when he would face the truth that would change everything. The secrets his wife was hiding would soon begin to unravel their life, leading to a tragedy that could not be prevented. Corey started to notice more and more small details that once seemed insignificant, but now they began to add up to something bigger. Mila was disappearing more often in the evenings and late at night, and her explanations were becoming vaguer. She wouldn't give clear answers about her work, and whenever Corey pressed for more details, she'd quickly change the subject or brush it off as not important. One evening, while Mila was out for another business meeting, Corey accidentally saw her phone, left behind at home. That was the moment when everything shifted. In her phone was a series of text messages with an unknown number, discussing meetings at hotels and restaurants. One of the messages read, "Same as always, tomorrow at 7 p.m. The payment will be as agreed." Corey felt his heart clench with dread. He couldn't believe his eyes. Everything pointed to the fact that his wife was living a double life. But he didn't know the whole truth yet, and he decided not to jump to conclusions, even though his mind was already consumed with worry and suspicion. Determined to find out more, Corey began his own investigation, keeping an eye on Mila. He couldn't stand by any longer. His mind was overwhelmed with suspicions that grew stronger with each passing day. One night, when Mila left for another meeting with clients, Corey decided to follow her. He got in his car and drove after her, keeping a distance so she wouldn't notice. He watched as Mila pulled up to a luxury hotel in the heart of the city. Corey knew this place wasn't meant for business meetings. He saw her step out of the car, dressed in an elegant gown, and head toward the entrance. His heart was pounding, adrenaline surged through him. Everything inside him screamed to turn back, but he couldn't stop. Corey parked his car and quietly entered the hotel. He hid in the shadows, trying to remain unnoticed. After a few minutes, he saw Mila walk out with a tall, well-dressed man. They were heading toward the elevator, and Corey noticed the man put his hand on the small of her back. A wave of nausea washed over him as he realized what was happening. Alone in the hotel lobby, Corey tried to process what he had just seen. His mind began piecing together the events, the meetings, the late-night business trips, the secret phone calls. This wasn't just a coincidence. Mila was hiding a secret life from him. Corey found her profile on a closed Escort site, and that discovery shattered his world. Mila's profile was adorned with photos where she looked perfect. It was his wife, but in her eyes, he saw a coldness he had never noticed before. The descriptions outlined her services and the sum she received for meetings with men. His heart ached with pain and shame. How could she hide this from him? How could she live in their home, pretending everything was normal, while her secret life was tearing their marriage apart? Corey felt betrayed, empty, and lost. He didn't know what to do next. Dark thoughts began to take shape in his mind about how to handle this revelation, but he knew his life would never be the same. The shadow of his wife's secret now loomed over their marriage. Corey couldn't accept what he had uncovered. He was consumed by a mixture of anger, pain, and despair. Each night, he sat at home, tortured by thoughts of how long Mila had been deceiving him. But the real nightmare began when he faced an even greater danger. Mila, trying to fix her situation, had started to wind down her activities as an escort. But one of her clients, Victor, a powerful and dangerous man, wasn't ready to let her go so easily. Victor wasn't just a wealthy client. His influence and connections extended far beyond the city, and his reputation was built on fear and brutality. One evening, when Corey came home, he found Mila crying in the kitchen. She tried to appear strong, but her hands were shaking, and her eyes betrayed her fear. When he asked what was wrong, she simply said that some people don't want to let her go. She didn't reveal all the details, but Corey could guess that one of her clients had started blackmailing her. It was Victor. He had sent her threats, stating that if she tried to leave the business, her secret would be exposed to the world, including Corey and their friends. He also hinted at physical violence if she didn't comply with his demands. Mila was trapped. For the first time, Corey saw how deeply she had gotten involved in this dangerous world. With each new threat from Victor, her fear grew. She was terrified that one day men would show up at their door, ready to carry out his threats. Corey was consumed by an internal conflict. He wanted to protect his wife despite the betrayal, but he didn't know how to fight a man whose power and influence reached into criminal circles. He realized that they couldn't handle this alone, but going to the police would mean exposing Mila. And though his mind told him they needed to act, the fear of Victor clouded all his thoughts. This chapter of their life was turning into a living nightmare. Victor continued to control their lives through threats and blackmail. The tension between Mila and Corey grew, and every day felt like it could be their last moment of peace. But what Corey didn't know was that Victor had already started keeping tabs on both of them. At any moment, he could make his move, and Mila and Corey's lives were in constant danger. Each day for Corey and Mila became a fight for survival. The threat from Victor loomed over their home like a dark shadow. Mila stayed home more often, locking herself in her room, avoiding even the neighbors, afraid that one of them might be on Victor's side. Her face grew pale, and her eyes dull. Corey watched as his wife crumbled under the pressure, but he didn't know how to help her. All this time, Corey tried to keep the situation under control. He spent sleepless nights, trying to devise a plan to save them. But every time he got close to a solution, Victor somehow put new obstacles in their way. Mysterious calls to their house with threats, strange figures lurking in the shadows near their home. It all made Corey feel helpless. Mila was becoming more and more distant. Corey noticed how she started hiding her phone, locking herself in the bathroom for hours, whispering during phone calls. He tried to talk to her, but Mila would always say the same thing. "I'm trying to protect us. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." But deep down, Corey's suspicions were growing. She was hiding something. He felt like the situation had spiraled out of control, and Mila was in much deeper than he could have ever imagined. Victor, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy their despair. His psychological pressure was relentless. He sent Mila on new tasks, demanding she return to her old life, threatening that her husband would find out everything if she refused. Every night ended with Mila in hysterics, and Corey would comfort her, not knowing how to break free from the darkness that had consumed their lives. Corey began to feel like he was losing control, not just of the situation, but of himself. Paranoia was setting in. Every movement outside seemed suspicious. Every word from Mila sounded like a hint of her secret life. He tried to follow her, to understand who she was talking to now, what she was planning. But her silence grew more oppressive, and their marriage felt more and more distant. Mila was sinking deeper into despair. Victor had left her no choice. She realized his power extended to people she never wanted to be involved with. One of his most powerful partners contacted her directly and made it clear that she could never leave the game. Mila now understood that their life had become a survival game, with Victor setting the rules. Every word, every gesture became a threat for Corey and Mila. Their home had turned into a trap of fear, where they constantly waited for something terrible to happen. They both knew that this tension couldn't last forever. Something was bound to happen. Corey felt like he was walking on a knife's edge. The psychological pressure Victor applied had pushed them to the breaking point. His marriage to Mila was on the verge of collapse, and every night spent in fear made their situation unbearable. But Corey wasn't ready to give up. He knew they had to confront Victor, or they'd live in fear forever. One night, Corey decided to act. After much contemplation, he insisted on having a serious conversation with Mila, demanding answers. For the first time in a long while, they sat down across from each other, and the tension in the room was palpable. He was honest, telling her that he couldn't live in lies any longer, and that they had to do something to stop Victor. Mila, however, was on the edge of breaking down. She looked exhausted and defeated. Her eyes were filled with fear, not just for herself but for Corey. For the first time, she confessed that Victor had not only been threatening her, but Corey as well. She had been forced to comply with his demands to protect her husband. But Corey could no longer contain his anger. It sounded like another excuse to him. And that's when something happened that became the turning point. Mila started receiving messages right in front of Corey. He grabbed her phone and saw threats from Victor. It was clear. Victor wasn't just blackmailing Mila. He was using her to keep Corey under control. Unable to bear the pressure any longer, Corey decided they needed to meet Victor face to face. He insisted that he was ready to confront him and convince him to leave them alone. Mila tried to dissuade him, but Corey couldn't be stopped. To him, this was the only solution. The next day, Corey and Mila went to meet Victor at an agreed-upon location, a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was tense, and Corey had a feeling it might be a trap, but he was determined. He couldn't live in fear anymore and saw only one way out, to end this once and for all. When they arrived, Victor was already waiting. His gaze was cold and merciless. He smiled as Corey and Mila walked in. The air was thick with danger, and Corey knew the situation could spiral out of control at any moment. Corey tried to negotiate with Victor, but it quickly became clear that Victor had no intention of letting them go. He hinted that he had his own plans for Mila and that she belonged to him. The phrase felt like a death sentence. In a fit of rage, Corey lunged at Victor, trying to stop him, but he wasn't quick enough. At that moment, Mila, realizing that both her life and her husband's were hanging by a thread, made a desperate move. She pulled out a gun hidden in her bag and, without hesitation, shot Victor. The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence. Victor collapsed to the ground, clutching his chest, while Mila stood above him, trembling as the weight of what she had just done sunk in. Corey stood in shock, watching everything unfold. He couldn't believe things had gone this far. Victor was dead, and their lives were now irreversibly changed. Mila fell to her knees next to the body, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking with shock. They both knew this was the end. But this end would bring consequences that would change their lives forever. After that fateful shot, everything seemed to freeze. Mila knelt beside Victor's body, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with horror as she realized what she had just done. Corey stood nearby, breathing heavily, his mind struggling to process what had happened. In an instant, their lives had changed irreversibly. They both knew they now had to figure out how to move forward. Staying there was dangerous. No one knew if Victor had sent someone to follow them. Corey realized that he had to take charge of the situation. He looked at Mila, her face pale, unable to take her eyes off Victor's body. Quietly but firmly, he said, "We have to leave. Now." They took Victor's phone and documents, trying to eliminate any evidence that could tie them to the crime. But fear had already settled deep in their hearts. The entire drive home, Corey couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every street seemed too quiet. Every movement in the rearview mirror made him anxious. Once home, they sat in silence. Mila curled up in a corner, hugging her knees, her gaze distant and unfocused. Corey tried to come up with a plan. He knew they had to get rid of the body, but what next? How could they continue living after this? Every step in his mind felt like a death sentence. Victor was dead, but his shadow still loomed over them. Soon, Corey realized that the danger hadn't disappeared. Victor wasn't just some lone wolf. He had a network of influence, and one of his partners, upon learning of his disappearance, launched his own investigation. When Corey and Mila thought they had escaped Victor, the truth began to slowly unravel. By August 2017, strange calls and messages started. Someone knew what had happened at the warehouse, and this someone made it clear that they were no longer safe. Corey realized that killing Victor was only the beginning. Now they were at the center of a dangerous game, with higher stakes than ever before. One of Victor's partners, who knew about his operations, began blackmailing them, demanding money in exchange for silence. He knew they had killed Victor and was ready to turn them over to the police if they didn't meet his demands. It was a new level of fear and desperation. Corey and Mila realized they now lived in a world where they couldn't trust anyone. Corey tried to find a way out. He knew they couldn't run forever, but every time they thought about going to the police, the fear of exposure paralyzed them. Corey began planning an escape, a move to another city, a new life under new names. But Mila was already on the verge of breaking. She could no longer bear the psychological pressure. One night, when Corey came home, he found Mila in the bathroom. She was sitting on the floor, curled up, her face streaked with tears. She couldn't fight the guilt and fear any longer. She whispered, "This is all my fault. I ruined everything." Corey, looking at her, realized that their love and their life had been destroyed. They had lost everything. The next morning, Corey decided they had to leave as soon as possible. But before they could make it out the door, Victor's men appeared at their doorstep. It was the end.